Thank you all for attending this session. My name is Juul Gooren. I'm not from around here. I'm from the Netherlands, Europe. And today I would like to talk about septet, crime prevention through environmental design, which is also commonly used in the United States, I believe. I'm a senior lecturer at the Hague University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, criminologist, mostly interested in public security, how people live together in cities and urban environments. And I want to walk you through some of the elements of septet and how our students actually apply it in projects. And I want to identify some of the possibilities. So I want to give you some tangible examples, how it could actually work and benefit public security. And at the same time, I would like to raise a couple of perhaps even ethical issues by overusing septet. So that is what I have in mind for you, upcoming 30 minutes. Feel free to interrupt or ask questions. Happy to answer them directly. Let's see if this works. It should work. Yeah, well, so our students, Safety and Security Management Studies is the program where I teach. Our students are asked to come up with smart solutions to prevent crime, urban decay, if you will. And this is not a classical criminology program where we use a lot of heavy theory. So we constantly ask ourselves, okay, from an applied science point of view, what can we give our students to implement? And one way to go is to think of crime prevention in terms of designing out crime. That is what we are trying to do at our program. And you can go numerous ways to design out crime. Obviously, there are ways to deter crime from happening. I offer a couple of pictures, and perhaps this one is obviously, the intention is to prevent animals from crossing. Perhaps not crime, but it's a clear example of a design to prevent something from happening. But the same could actually be said when we look at the bench. What does the bench stand for? What does it try to prevent, you think? Fatigue. Yes, that would be the positive function of the bench. But in terms of quality of life, crime, loitering, I mean, these benches are obviously specifically designed not to relax for too long. So these benches are not designed for vagrants to lay on for the rest of the day.
No sleeping.
No sleeping, exactly. So you can sit for a couple of minutes and then move on. So, day to day we come across all kinds of objects that have a particular function, but there is also this notion of designing out crime. These are obviously, we could call them, deterring something from happening, but you could also turn around and think about something positive. We also come up with all kinds of smart designs to actually enable certain behavior. I think this one is a pretty good example, right? Designed specifically to make sure that men, do their business in urinal, right? Aim right, exactly. And when it comes to crime prevention, we can learn an awful lot from marketing, right? The commercial world. I mean, if I go with my 4-year-old daughter to a candy store, to a grocery store, at the counter, she will reach for that candy bar. And these candy bars are obviously also placed in a certain way. So my baby daughter will ask me, can you please buy this for me? So what we try to do in our program at Safety and Security Management Studies is to combine both things. How could we enable social behavior, and how can we make antisocial behavior less likely? In an ideal world, you would like to combine both things. And I think the whole notion of septet has elements of both. I'll talk about that a bit more later. So for those of you who are not intimately familiar with septet, there's obviously classic work done by Jeffries, by Newman. Much of it is based on the routine activity theory. Much of it is also grounded in rational choice theory. But the idea is, through physical design and delineation and use of space, you can actually reduce crime or the opportunities of crime. As the routine activity theory has it, for crime to occur, you need to have a motivated offender, a suitable target, and guardianship, right? So how to make certain targets less attractive and how to organize more guardianship, that is the trick. So with proper septet implementation, you could perhaps reduce certain crimes from taking place, like burglary, like loitering. It can take many forms, so it could actually be an alarm system, a fence. At the same time, it could also be, are you familiar with the mosquito? Is that also something that was implemented in the States? To make sure that youngsters don't loiter, you would have that pitch of noise to, scare them away. You could also think that is also an audio example of septet. So you can, apply it in numerous settings with, different aims and objectives. And ideally speaking, it will reduce fear and improve the quality of life, right? Because that is, under that general heading, that's what we're talking about in an urban setting. So I'm not talking about crime exclusively, but larger, we can talk about how we live together. And, what people find important is not only the absence of crime, but in general, obviously, some form of social interaction, right? We are social. So septet applied properly should not only be about preventing crime from happening, but also enabling people going out on the streets and hanging out with each other, right? So that is what we like to instruct our students. We don't want our students to come up with barbed wire, fences, alarm systems. You can go down that road, but that will be, not a very pleasant place to be in, obviously. So we'd like to combine these more formal and technological ways of implementing septet with, you could say, informal social control, which is obviously also very important in terms of preventing crime from happening. So let me give you a tangible example. So you can have a delineated place designed for something specific to occur, for specific users. We would, using septet, we would call that it is for legitimate users, using the space for its intended purpose. You can discriminate between the legitimate user and potential offenders, people who should not be there. It's not their place. So they might display unacceptable behavior, criminal behavior. Once again, we're talking about quality of life in general. So I'm talking about deviating from social norms, and that's not exclusively criminal behavior, but it's more broad. And at the same time, we should also factor in observers. So people surrounding a particular place, also very important, especially in terms of social control. They are the eyes and the ears on the street. It might function as a deterrent. At the same time, these people might also be witnesses if something happens. So this is a playground in Amsterdam, and we see a couple of things. What is your impression if you look at these three pictures? Hopefully they are visible. We see a guy on a bench. We see broken glass. Also traces of drug use. We see some branches, some bushes. What happened here? Let me ask it differently. Who is in this particular case, the legitimate user, you would argue? Not the drug user. So this is a playground, mind you. Right.
I would not have thought that was.
No. Obviously, perhaps I should have also added a picture of a slide, for example. But it is obviously designed for, I don't know, moms, dads, small children with strollers. They are there to hang out, to relax, have a good time. But obviously, provide you a bit of context. Those people left the scene once these people came in, the vagrants, the beggars, and also the classic example of youth loitering, hanging around, also some drug dealing. So what actually happened is that the potential offenders took over and made the place very unpleasant for the legitimate users. There's not a lot of moms out there who would argue, well, let's just play there and watch other people shoot up or, do other unacceptable behavior. So how could we prevent this from happening using septet? I tell you. And this actually worked in practice. So what happens is septet is about a couple of elements. So places where there is natural surveillance, natural access control, and natural territorial reinforcement, in these places, crime is less likely to occur, right? Because people feel watched. And another important one is obviously maintenance, which also goes under the heading of, you would perhaps call it the broken windows theory, the famous one, right? So these are all signs of urban decay. The legitimate users left. So what the municipality came up with is they trimmed some of these bushes, got rid of some of these trees. And that made it actually less pleasant for homeless people just to lay there and do their thing, because all of a sudden they were in plain sight, right? So, getting rid of these bushes, cutting some of these trees, obviously maintenance is important, so you have to get rid of some of the glass, so you have to clean up the place. And there was that other category, teenagers, they would be on bikes and they would be dealing drugs. And every time a police officer would actually enter the scene, they would actually flee very easily on bike. So the police had a hard time catching them. So what they did next to getting rid of these trees and bushes, they also placed some of these barriers, obstacles you see everywhere. So, it makes it more pedestrian friendly. So vehicles cannot move that smoothly. So that way, these youngsters were no longer able to flee the scene that quickly. So they were actually caught by some of these police officers. Well, combining all of these efforts, at some point, the legitimate users once again took over. And then you have broad daylight, you have moms, dads, small children, and then the place all of a sudden becomes less pleasant for the potential offenders, right? So this is a clear example of how septet can work in practice by using some of these core elements, if you will. So natural surveillance, lines of sight, access control, which is I'll talk about this a bit more, which is very difficult if we're talking about public security, because who owns the city? You don't want to ask for money to enter a playground. You don't want high fences, but some delineation of place is important. Territorial reinforcement. So if an environment looks like this, then people have the impression, well, nobody cares what I do, so I might as well also just drop something and walk away. So if you combine these with maintenance, expression of ownership, then it could very well have an effect, right? This is what we would call an example of situational crime prevention, right? It's not so much about social crime prevention by doing something about the root causes or what motivates the offender. It's just altering a particular environment, right? Making it less attractive. So that's what septet basically stands for, right? And I think all of you are familiar with criminological knowledge on this slide. It's heavily influenced, the likelihood of committing crime by the chance of being caught. So the right design and the correct and effective use of a space discourages criminal behavior. That's what we're basically talking about. And you can apply this everywhere. And what we try to do in our program is to translate it into public space. So we're talking about public security, which makes it a bit more complicated, because with certain places, think of a company, it has a clear boundary, the inside and the outside, and you can definitely do a lot in terms of access control, right? Who has access to a particular building or who has access to a particular vault. With public space, this is much more difficult. So it's more subtle, if you will, because you would like to still be that inclusive city, right? At least that's what our program aspires to do, right? You don't want security overriding the core purpose of a particular space or place, which is, simply hanging out together. So that is sometimes tough, finding that balance. So it also becomes very diffuse. In the playground example in Amsterdam, you could perhaps discriminate between legitimate and illegitimate users and a particular activity, like kids using a slide, mom and dad paying attention. But, in reality, of course, things become very blurred. What activities are allowed in public space. However, nowadays we have all kinds of signs saying no loitering, right? No trespassing, no alcohol, etc., but still activities which are unauthorized, vary considerably, and there is a lot of contestation, I would argue, among people, what is acceptable. What septet, for the most part, stands for is this idea, the routine activity theory idea. This is a model I got from a handbook for certified protection officers. It basically stands for this idea of making targets less attractive, right? By coming up with all kinds of psychological barriers next to physical barriers, right? The physical barriers, as I mentioned before, are more difficult in public space because you do want to allow a diversity of people being somewhere at a certain time. But you can come up with smart psychological barriers, perhaps, right? So this is, the idea is that at some point, potential offenders will weigh the pros and cons of displaying unauthorized behavior or unwanted behavior and will move elsewhere, right? It's obviously very naive to assume that they will stop with these activities altogether. So there's always this issue of displacement, but this is one of the core notions behind the septet model, I would argue. But next to that model, very much grounded in rational choice theory, right? Weighing the pros and the cons. And, obviously a con is getting caught. You don't want that. But in our program, we do emphasize another aspect of septet, which is not so much based on routine activity theory, but more based on other theoretical or criminological theory out there, namely the control theory, bonds that people establish between one another. And next to rational choice, there is the ecological theory, so the very well-known Chicago school. And that is actually second-generation application of septet. So apart from using situational crime prevention exclusively, setting up barriers, you want to emphasize, some of these positive ways of enabling certain proto-social behavior, right? So you do want inclusion, you want community connectivity, you want cohesion, neighborhood capacity. So it is about bonds, people knowing each other, having ties, could be strong ties, could be weak ties, so looking out for each other in the neighborhood. And obviously the Chicago school also teaches us it's important to do something in terms of what we nowadays call collective efficacy, right? Having a degree of social cohesion, some social control. So you would like septet to actually cater to also that positive side of things instead of deterring negative things. Also to avoid securitizing everything and destroying all kinds of social tissue. So just you can ignore this particular sheet. It is a combination of rational choice, as I mentioned, control theory, the famous one by Hirschi, having these bonds, and at the same time, ecological theory. So you do want some social organization, some tissue. So that is what you want. And if you want this for your city, for a particular neighborhood, you have to be, wary of overusing septet from a purely security management perspective. Applying security management hardcore doing something about physical security, designing out unauthorized behavior or unauthorized persons. That language is all about deterring people from entering, denying people from entering, detecting certain trespassing, delaying perpetrators. That makes sense in a closed-off environment, right? Like a business or an organization. But, in public space, that is just very problematic. I mean, most of us don't want that city because we, once again, want also a very inclusive city. So that is a very difficult act of balancing. So who is the legitimate user and what is authorized behavior? These are some of the questions we have students answer for us. And obviously, they encounter that there's a lot of contestation. It's very diffuse. It's not on paper. I mean, the city is for everyone. And what they encounter in numerous parts of The Hague, we also have parts where crime is occurring, where we could speak of urban decay. But they find out that there is some kind of trade-off to be made between people who want a very lively area where a lot of things happen, right? So people hanging out on the streets, playing music, having a good time, and people who put more emphasis on it should be livable, right? That's people who typically want more law, order, peace and quiet. And obviously in any city that can cause some frictions, right? So you want to have a nighttime economy. At the same time, you have people complaining about the noise, right? Or about the use of alcohol. So that is a problem, right? And I'll give you a couple of examples of two conflicting parties and how to solve this, ideally speaking, to give you an impression. And the problem is if you use septet in a very crude security management type of way with all the Ds, you would want to do something about the presence of people in public space, so keeping unauthorized people out. And if you are more into the control theory, ecological theory, you care more for social control and social cohesion, you think it's a good thing if a particular space attracts lots of people. Because lots of people, not only is it fun to hang out in the city, but lots of people can also prevent crime by being the eyes and the ears on the street, right? These are some of the famous ideas also coined by, forgot her name now, Life and Death in the American City. Help me out here. Who's the author? Come back to that. But there are also a couple of, lots of authors who argue, the presence of people is just vital, is very important. So oftentimes, and this goes for all kinds of things. Having people on the street can actually prevent burglary. There's also a very cool project in The Hague, and in that project, local police officers encourage dog ownership, right? And dog ownership is encouraged because by owning a dog, you will go out at night, right? Because the dog has to pee and poo. Going out at night, once again, might deter crime because you have people actually on the streets, right? So with these notions in mind, it's good actually to have people on the streets. You don't want people to withdraw and lock themselves up at home because then the street is deserted and perhaps more prone to attract unauthorized behavior. But, quality of life issues, people tend to differ. For some people, a barbecue is, a fun time. For other people, it's just a lot of noise. So they will actually call a community police officer and do something about it. My students have done some research and they, just to pick 3 random examples, they give the example of graffiti, also commonly used in the United States, right? For some people, graffiti is vandalism, perhaps for most people, I don't know. But for other people, it is just aesthetically pleasing. It's, it's an expression, it's an art form. So in The Hague, they encountered people who are, for and people who are against. How to solve this issue? That's a big question. Another one, I'll come back to solving it, possibly. Another one is neighbors complaining about kids playing outdoors, playing soccer, causing noise. Oftentimes, the conflict is also generational in nature. So you would have older people complaining about graffiti, older people complaining about young kids. But you can also think of a particular street, burglary takes place, how to prevent that burglary. Once again, the playground example in Amsterdam, getting rid of the trees. For some people, that makes sense. Natural surveillance, lines of sight. But there's also people who like trees, who are, who just like green stuff, who are into nature, which is also aesthetically pleasing. It's a nice environment. So how to solve these issues? So my students, we asked them to come up with some kind of solution, factoring in people who are for and people who are against. So they came up with a particular design place where people could actually put graffiti on walls, right? Organized by the municipality. That way you could actually canalize some of that expression, some of that energy, and listening to people who would actually find it an act of vandalism. With kids playing outside, you could also think more carefully about, okay, where do we put certain soccer pitches? Perhaps not next to a residential area, but perhaps move it away a couple of yards. So that was also a way, to still offer these facilities to youngsters, but listening to the complaints of neighbors. Instead of cutting trees, you could also trim trees, right? That could also be an option. So this is actually one of the big lessons of applying septet more carefully. It's not a zero-sum game, right? So you want to factor in as many stakeholders as possible and cater to their wishes, if that's possible, right? So it's a balancing act. So you have to be, summing up, you have to be very aware of your particular surrounding, right? So applying it to public security, you have to factor in different interests. Our students also apply this model to leisure parks, for example. And I gave this example before. You don't want to turn, a leisure park into a concentration camp. So some of my students immediately came up with barbed wire. Well, that's not the way to go, right? You want to offer these holiday people, you want to offer them an enjoy, carefree time with family and friends. Well, the same could actually be said also applying it to public security, right? You want to make sure that there's also positive social interaction. Summing up, what is then the right design? It can encourage the right behavior. Sometimes it is difficult to discriminate between authorized people and authorized behavior, but thinking about it carefully can actually be helpful, as the Amsterdam playground example illustrates, hopefully. What's also a very important lesson nowadays, architectures are asked to make sure spaces include numerous activities. You don't want an exclusively residential area, because that residential area will be vacant between 9 and 5, right? So you want synchronous spaces where multiple things happen throughout the day, right? Where people actually reside, live, also work, play, because that is also an effective deterrent, right? And that, once again, it also illustrates why industrial areas are sometimes very problematic, because these are very monofunctional areas, right? So from septet point of view, multifunctional is the way to go. Increasing or decreasing social distance among people is also helpful, right? Because it makes us aware that we are very much alike. Ideally speaking, it will lead to more tolerance. So you want multiple people interacting, engaging with one another. In some areas, this might be, obviously, problematic, because these are areas, high crime areas. But ideally speaking, this is helpful. And, to conclude, an inclusive space, public security as an inclusive space, a multi-purpose space, ideally speaking, breeds more tolerance and is ultimately a more indirect way to prevent crime, because it's also very much based on trust and reciprocity. So that's a different narrative than the crude security management narrative of all the Ds. So that's what we try to do. Obviously, there's still a lot of research to be done. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Are there any questions?
You were going to say something about ethics. You said you were going to talk something about that.
Yeah, for me, the ethics part of things is, okay, who owns the city? So I would argue if you exclude all kinds of people, to me, that raises an ethical question, right? So for me, that's the ethical side of things. At the same time, it's also about effectivity, because I believe if you include more people, in the long run, it might also be effective in terms of preventing crime, right? Thank you.
Internet laws in this country different from internet laws in other countries. Other countries are calling for internet norms. We're saying forget internet norms, because there's some things we like to see and do on the internet that other countries wouldn't allow, because maybe it's religious beliefs or just maybe cultural beliefs. And then we just need to hold businesses accountable for protecting our data. Right now, the laws lean more so as protecting the organizations, more so than protecting the consumer. I mean, we saw this week, last week, Zuckerberg was up here. Facebook just stay in the news. If I was Zuckerberg, I was like, you know what? If you want Facebook, go get on the Tor browser. We're taking the whole operations and we're going to the dark web. I'm tired of sitting in front of Congress, getting my face pushed in with a bunch of people that don't really understand it. And to make our security practices stronger. That's what I would do. I would push it to the dark web. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So when you talk about the dark web, so the web is running internet protocol working either form or sales, or maybe both.
Yeah, you can run both, right?
So if the dark web is only the IPv6 only, how do you access it?
Through the Tor browser. The Tor browser is designed for privacy. Like, some researchers argue that you don't need a VPN with the Tor browser. I disagree with that. I believe you need to have a VPN for everything you do to establish that tunnel for your own privacy. Does that make sense?
Well, not really. So the VPN has nothing to do with IPv4 and V6.
Well, IPv6, all it is just your IP addresses, right? But if you're using the Tor browser and you're running through all of these different relays, what IP address are you really using?
So either one. So it depends on the website. If the website is V6 only, you have to be a V6 client. Your machine has physically running V6 to access those websites. And that's the Tor browser is using IPv6 as well. So that's a separate question, because it is complete. So you mentioned about the controls.
Right.
There's nobody knows whether or not government is controlling that Tor or part of the dark web.
You're right, and I won't say whether they are or whether they're not. You will not get that out of me.
Right, but the challenge is for the dark web running IPv6 only.
Mm-hmm.
And people may have a false assumption that they have control. It's physically separate.
Yes.
So IPv6 and V4 is a complete separate.
Yes.
It's separate stack. If you are not enabled V6, you cannot see the V6 traffic. You cannot visit V6 website.
Yes.
Anyway, that makes
So, but think about it. If you were on the dark web, you would create a website that is interchangeable with IPv4, but IPv4.
No, the purpose is V6 only, so that it will only people knows what it is will be able to access it.
Yes. I don't know about that, because you can get to these websites without using the Tor browser. I know that for a fact.
Okay.
Anybody else? The key is, I encourage all of you to go to the dark web. Be safe. I think it's something we all need to experience. And I think it's something that we all need to know about. Because, I mean, back to the gentleman's point there, what happens if the government is running this? Or one government or governments? I don't know. It's a good thing to me if the government is running. I don't know. I'm not going to speak to that. But I'm just saying, I think it could one day be a safe place to do business. I think right now, if a company is not leveraging the dark web, that they're probably behind times, and that they're not going to be very successful in conducting some of their sensitive operations. Yes.
How do you combat the stigma behind it? Because maybe somebody doesn't want to deal with the publicity of a bank's operating on the dark web because there's a sinister implication behind it. So how do you address that?
Right, and we have done that. I mean, when I say we people have done that. There are people that operate on the dark web every day, and they're not doing anything sinister. Think about, the government. It's no secret that the government operate on the dark web. You can't tell me everything the government is doing on the dark web is sinister. It's not. The government is doing it for secrecy's sake. So if the government can do it for secrecy's sake, why can't businesses do it for secrecy's sake? I'm just asking. I just think I can't wait for my bank to come up on the dark web. In a good way, to offer a service, not for my data being out there. Yes, sir.
So earlier at the beginning, you mentioned that 96% that people have in dark web.
Right.
Do you have a further breakdown? Which part of it?
I do, sir, but I didn't want to bring it in here because it took the dark. It was new. I just found it a couple weeks ago, and I haven't had time to explore it. Okay. But it took the dark web, and it had all the traffic and everything, and it had parts of the dark web that was new to me. I was like, man, I need to call somebody on this one because I don't understand the different layers it's trying to get into. But what concerns me about that even more is that, is it the government or law enforcement officials forcing criminals to develop, different pockets inside of the dark web that we'll never have access to? That's what concerns me even more.
So what I'm trying to get to is that if majority of the website is already dark web or deep web, maybe the concept should be changed. Because basically the whole web is dark web.
I like that. I like that. I like that.
Because otherwise, so those you listed is just a portal, like a search engine.
I like that. I like that idea. Maybe the regular internet is coming to an end. I like that idea. I like that idea. You made my point for me. I like that. Anybody else? All right.
But just to reiterate, going into the dark web, secrecy
yes.
is the key. So you're making sure that you're not using your personal.
Before you go to the dark web, I encourage you to. There's several YouTube videos out there that are really good. If you take my information, I send you the links that are really good. It tells you how to get to the dark web. It tells you how to keep yourself safe. It tells you the do's and don'ts of the dark web. And so I encourage everybody to go just to experience it. Just to experience it. And I tell you, take a link, to one of these crazy websites and go and see it for yourself. And then you will become an advocate for spreading the word on the dark web. But don't necessarily spread the dark web on the negative things. Also spread the word on the positive things about the dark web. Because like the gentleman alluded to here, it might be the way of the future. Maybe the government is owning something. The government's going to make a lot of money now because they own the Tor browser, and now they're going to charge us all for using the Tor browser for our own privacy, right? I'm just saying. I don't know. Maybe that's the way of the future. But thank you all. Yeah.